Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is Listening Beyond the Soundbites. Ben Kinsley has joined us tonight, co-host and co-producer, and a return guest, David F. Kelly.
That's right.
Very
the
nice.
F is for
Welcome,
Fitzgerald.
David. Fitzgerald, well, that
Yeah.
makes sense, yes.
Good in Irish.
Yes, David was
Common
with us
Vermont
about a month or so ago, perhaps,
Right.
talking about Act 46, but it was like a few days before he submitted this lawsuit.
Yeah.
And now we're here to talk about
And
the lawsuit.
I have to tell you, in recent weeks, I feel like a broken record. You know,
Wow.
Act 46 has just consumed more of my life than I planned.
Well, it must be 24/7. I told you I went to the U32 meeting, and those people had no appreciation for the attorneys who were doing this on your own time.
For the most
no
part,
money.
Most of the attorneys like me are doing it pro bono.
And that's hours
We
and
have
hours.
one attorney that's getting paid a reduced rate and contributing 5 hours a week. So,
Oh, wow.
So the attorneys that have worked on this have done it simply out of a passion for our schools
Right.
and the future of small rural schools in Vermont,
Well, we thank
especially
you
in the
for that.
poorest towns.
Because I was surprised at the reaction of the people in the crowd, besides the fact they really didn't know where we were in the process
I have to
or
tell
much
you,
about it.
I'm sometimes shocked at how few people who are presumably policymakers
Right, have no clue.
and leaders don't fully understand exactly
Right.
the transformation that we're forcing some communities to go through.
Yeah, it's staggering.
You know, I think we would all hope that when a school closes, there's a real reason, either not enough students or somehow the quality isn't adequate.
Right.
But when we design a system that says the biggest town in the area is going to control everything, and if they need to juice up their average daily membership or if they need new revenues, they can reach over to a smaller neighbor and grab
the kids.
grades or grab the whole school. That's not the most common sense way
No.
to get to greater educational quality.
I agree. They don't hear those words much in this discussion.
Well,
Quality.
you know, interestingly, that's how it started. That's one of the goals,
Yeah.
presumably, of Act 46. But this kind of wave of consolidation, you know, history repeats itself. And we've gone through various waves of consolidation. And some of them, I think, were really important. But the current wave we're going through, we can see the consequences around the country.
Right.
They went through it 10 years ago in Maine. They're getting
And Maine
divorced
has
now.
they're pulling out of that.
Many of the smaller rural towns are doing everything they can to
Yep.
get divorced, and Maine has created a divorce law.
Right.
West Virginia, the consequences have been horrendous. North Dakota, Nebraska. And what is happening is we're participating in a process that is hollowing out and ghettoizing small rural towns. Between the power of the internet and what we're doing to the retail world, and then the consolidation of school districts where we take the small elementary schools that are at the heart of rural America
Right.
out of town, the reason for being there disappears. And in Vermont, it's particularly troubling because Vermont is at a crossroads where rural Vermont could be reinvented right now. We have a whole new possibility with value-added agriculture.
Right.
And the internet creates new possibilities for people to work, you know, do this remote.
Yeah, because I had a meeting with the secretary French, right?
Yeah.
And he is very big on technology. I mean, he looks to the future of how to use technology. I think he's a little late. This discussion technology should have happened before Act 46.
And what that technology does is it says a small rural school can have access to every course at Harvard University.
Right.
You know, the notion that we have to somehow now empower bigger communities to close, especially the elementary schools,
Yeah.
it's just senseless.
You know,
And it's an old, outdated model of education.
It is. It doesn't recognize. My wife teaches English, and it's remarkable. One of the books she sometimes teaches is a book called The Kite Runner. And so when she teaches that book, she connects with a school in Pakistan or Afghanistan, and she talks to kids on Skype.
wow.
Here's a school in Hardwick, Vermont, and they want to know about life in Asia, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Muslim countries that are undergoing some remarkable changes. And in this tiny school in Hardwick, Vermont, they're online talking to people. I coach high school debate. I've coached small schools like Craftsbury, but we practice with Boston Latin, probably the best debate school in the country. I call them up, I say, do you guys want to have a scrimmage? Let's scrimmage. And we use Skype.
Oh, wonderful.
And so all of these technologies, but we have such a sclerotic educational bureaucracy, and it is so arrogant that creativity and inventiveness are almost impossible to find.
And I think one of the overarching points in this whole, unfolding of Act 46 as it's been rolled out. I mean, we're talking about a law that was written almost 5 years ago, right? And the way that the law has been interpreted, the way that it's been implemented has been, immovable. Like they refuse.
I don't understand that.
Yeah.
All of the legislators that were engaged in this, or most of them, have said over and over again, the governor, Shumlin, they have all said, look, we understood that if a community is meeting the goals of Act 46, if you're providing real academic quality and you're doing it at an efficient cost, then we don't want to, if you're not broken, we don't want to fix you.
Right.
That's what they all said. And then what the board said when they issued their final order was, wherever it's possible, we merged them. It didn't matter if they were doing their job or not. We just merged everybody we could. I mean, that defies common sense. Why would you take a school that's doing perfectly well and try to mess it up?
Yeah, and it's interesting, having followed Act 46 really since its inception and the couple, bills that preceded it. It was sold on its flexibility.
It was.
It was sold on its flexibility, and even despite that, it was a fairly narrow margin that it passed the House.
Yeah.
It's 25 or 30 votes, I think, is what it passed.
Well, I don't understand how we got here. It makes me sad because the consequences are so significant. And when I look especially at the part of Vermont I know the best, which is the Northeast Kingdom, and I try to imagine the consequences of taking these small elementary schools out of towns like Coventry and Irisburg and Greensboro and Glover. Some of these are just great schools, and these communities are not Greenwich, Connecticut. Mm-hmm. These communities have real demographic challenges and economic challenges, but the students in those schools get an enormous amount of individual attention. And if we are going to come to grips with issues like being economically disadvantaged and some of the consequences of that, it seems to me the last thing we want to do is take schools and put them even further away from the kids and the families that need to be engaged and that need attention.
Because a lot of those schools are the heart of the community. The way rural Vermont works and
they
rural
are
areas,
the heart of the community.
They're it, right?
They are it.
And you yanked it out.
And what happens is, especially for disadvantaged people, the further away the school becomes, the harder it is to get there,
Right.
the less opportunity to participate in extracurricular activities, the less opportunity for those people to be engaged with school boards or with teachers, the more time they spend on buses. And the irony of the whole thing, and I can see how this is going to play out in our community, you lose a few grades, they move into a bigger school in the bigger community, eventually the local school closes, you spend more money on buses, more time on buses, but then you need a bond issue to renovate and reconfigure
Right.
the school with the more students.
Right.
You haven't saved any money.
No.
That's what happened in
No.
Maine. Nobody saved any
No.
money.
Yeah.
Well, we apparently in Berlin, we had this. Our costs are going to go up 7 cents.
You want
100.
to?
I mean, that's like hello. That's
I-
ridiculous.
If we look around the state, all of this notion about, oh, Act 46 is going to save money, it's silly.
Yeah.
And if you look at some of the analysis, and I can't, using the word analysis is really not fair because they didn't do any analysis, but when you look at what the agency
Yeah.
gave the legislature for reports on the financial consequences of Act 46, it's meaningless. What I just I don't know. I don't know. I get really discouraged
Frustrated, eh?
sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so I
What
think
can you
I think
say?
it's interesting to go back and it was sold to the legislature on the fact of it being flexible, but it was sold
That was
to
2015, right? Was that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 15.
it was sold
Yeah.
to the public as a cost-saving measure,
Wrong.
and also and also better educational outcomes.
Well, you know, there are so many ways we could save money in this state. One of the things that really drives me crazy is the fact that our teachers have become so much parents, social
Oh, for
workers,
sure.
teachers. Everything is happening in the classroom.
Right.
We've got an enormous bureaucracy that's supposedly helping these families and
Right.
children. We've got mental health agencies, we've got the Department of Children and Families, and they're all disconnected.
Yep.
The real connection to traumatized children and disadvantaged children is in the classroom.
Right.
Frequently with teachers that haven't had the professional development they need, and it seems to me one of the things we ought to do is the Department of Children and Families ought to have offices in our schools.
Yeah. Oh,
Absolutely.
they've talked about that. They should. I agree with
Yeah.
you.
And we need more guidance counselors with some of the problems
Real
we have.
guidance counselors.
Real guidance
Yeah.
counselors. But we've got a huge bureaucracy that's disconnected, that doesn't
Right.
even have a clue.
Right.
And I mean, I have some contact as an attorney with the Department of Children and Families, and I have to tell you, it's disappointing.
Yeah.
I think there are plenty of other places where we could save money. We have some superintendents, some that are doing a great job, some oversee 13 districts, and do a fabulous job with 13 districts.
Right.
We've got other superintendents with 2 or 3 districts who don't know what the hell they're doing.
Right.
So as far as I'm concerned, every superintendent should have at least 13 districts, and they should be supporting the school administrators, not managing them.
There you go.
They should let
Well,
principals
we've
run the
talked here.
schools.
This is my idea, and a lot of other people's, is to have these supervisor unions around the tech ed centers. Make that be the center, so
Sure.
that everybody. That's a set. This is a tech center. There's the area, and that'd be 14. So
That'd
Is it-
work.
yeah,
That'd be
that's what I
better.
always thought, and then really focus on tech ed.
And then you have a really clear funnel.
And I want to
Exactly.
be clear. I mean, there are some superintendents who I think are downright heroic.
Yeah.
I think some are doing a great job. There are some that shouldn't be in the education business.
Do you know, I spent a lot of time one day, about a couple months ago, looking up the definition of property tax
Yeah.
and what other states use against property tax. You're paying for the property and hardcore stuff. You're not paying, we're paying for all the human services charges that have slowly been charged through the schools, and which should actually be charged to human services in the general fund. That would wake them up.
Yeah.
But I mean, that would be robbing Peter to pay Paul. But at least we know how much we're spending and how much is folded into property tax. You want to get property tax cut? Just charge property tax.
Well,
That'd wake them up.
somehow it just seems to me that the burden of dealing with the most challenging issues of our time shouldn't fall entirely on the classroom teacher.
Oh,
Right.
And but that's where it falls. And you know something? For years, I've been a zealous advocate for containing property taxes and education expenses. But quite frankly, I think teachers need to be paid what they deserve.
Totally agree.
And we need to have a more professional cadre of teachers.
Yeah. They really work very hard, but I mean, every 2 years we're changing what they should be teaching. You know, no child left behind. And I mean, when I was in the Department of Ed, there were another new, who knows what, and then they had to learn how to do that, and nothing's worked. I just think that reading, writing, arithmetic, and let them teach the kids.
So I want to go back to this cost thing really quick because I think it's important because this is one of the things that Act 46 was sold on, right? And it's very clear that aside from a few of the early districts that went in on Act 46, ones that most of which were already having discussions about merging prior to Act 46 being in place, there really haven't been any cost savings. And even the former chair of the State Board of Education admitted that.
Well, you have some people, some superintendents have come forward and they said, well, we saved $250,000 here, or we saved $250,000 here. You know, we spent, I don't know, tens of millions implementing
Right.
Act 46
Yeah.
already. And what I've heard from the districts that I represent is all of us with these forced mergers are looking at increased taxes, not decreased
Right,
taxes.
right.
Right.
And I think we ought to be realistic and say, look, if it's not working, let us separate and do it our own way. I certainly don't think our education system in Vermont is perfect. There's plenty of room for improvement, but we need systems that nurture creativity and imagination and inventiveness. If we had $31 million to spend on making our schools better, I could think of a dozen ways to do more.
Right.
You know, one of the things that I believe is that there's a whole group of students in Vermont that are neglected, and they are sometimes our best and our brightest students. Students that really have a passion and a talent can exhaust advanced placement courses pretty quickly. And at least today we have Act 77 and we have early college and dual enrollment, and that's a big step forward. But there's so much more we could be doing. I think more students ought to be able to take advantage of international exchange programs and get exposed to other countries and other cultures. And I think, quite frankly, I think every school budget ought to have a piece that I would call the I Have a Dream scholarship piece of the budget. And for students that are outstanding, that show passion and talent beyond what they can access in a high school, let them go. Let them. We had a young girl while I was the chair of the Hazen School Board who wanted to study at the Oxbow School of Visual Arts in Napa, California. And I said, look, she's exhausted everything here. Let her go. Let her take her tuition. And you know what? That young girl is now at the Pratt Institute of Art on the president's list on a scholarship.
Whoa.
Because she had a dream and we let her pursue the dream. But
awesome.
you know what we do? We keep some kids literally locked up in our school buildings.
You think it's because of the money that goes along
Of
with
course
the
it
kids?
is.
I was trying
Of
to be
course it
nice.
is.
It is because of the money.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because
always.
because
Yeah, right.
because public education in Vermont is focused on institutional survival.
Right.
It's not focused on the student and what's absolutely best for this student.
Right.
We talk about personal learning plans. I think we ought to get real and say, let's really have personal learning plans. Let's say to you young people here in Vermont, dream. Imagine something bigger and better. And if you think collectively you want to learn something about your roots in Ireland, well, let's find a way for you to do it. Or if you're interested in what we can do to work more closely with disadvantaged communities in Africa, great, dream about it, let's do it.
Sounds like a campaign slogan, David.
Well, I'm not running for anything.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, that's so cool. The passion, and that we have to get to the questions here. We have before. I just wanted to bring people up to speed on what's been happening. We had a bill in. Well, Act 46 took effect, and it's actually in effect, and we're supposed to be merging June of this year.
July 1st.
July 1st,
Yeah.
but we're supposed to be done. But there is a bill in the House that was passed, which would give some
Yeah, yeah.
a year's.
Believe me, I read the bill.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
It made no sense.
But we're on it, so we love it.
You know what? Look, I know the legislators that are working on it are really trying to help.
Yeah.
How H39 got put together, you know.
How they made the selections.
You know,
yeah.
I have no idea what they were smoking.
Yep.
I mean, but it was silly.
Washington County made it to the year, so we were
But
excited.
but I want to be clear. There are people in the legislature that work really, really hard for solutions, and I should give credit where credit is due. Senator Perchik from Washington County, I think, has really tried hard to find common sense solutions. One of my heroes is Carolyn Partridge from down in the southern part of the state.
Right.
God knows Carolyn, she voted for Act 46.
Well, I think a
but
lot of them did, and they're
she-
sort of regretting it, I
and
think.
She's worked so hard
Yeah.
to try to find good
Yeah.
solutions. There's lots. Anthony Polina's worked hard.
Yeah.
And you know, I'm a Republican. Here I'm giving praise to these, you know,
Well, you should
progressives.
give praise where praise is due.
But I'm not sure I'm a Republican anymore these days.
Well, you and me both, but that's another show.
That's a whole nother show.
That's another show. I have anyway. So when I stood up at this U32 meeting and I told them this year's extension has only been passed by one house. That bill has to go over to the Senate, and they haven't even taken it up yet.
I think they are.
Are
I think
they
they
now?
are taking
Tomorrow.
it
Because,
up.
oh, tomorrow. Oh, are we going to that? We have
But
to talk about it.
and you know, gosh, I have some good friends in the Senate. I have lots of state senators. I just have, you know, boundless respect for. But it's in, I think, Senator Baruth's committee
Yes,
to get
right,
started,
And he so wants this to happen. So.
and you know, I don't understand. It's like he's got some
Yeah.
personal ego involved in
Yeah.
this or something. It
Well,
just-
I
he's
don't know.
a good chunk of Act 46 was his creation.
Right.
okay,
yeah.
but
So he's very vested in it to pass.
but what we should be talking about is what's in the best interest of our schools and our students.
Right.
And
right.
you know,
Oh, right.
That's what education's about, right?
Yeah, right. The kids.
Yeah.
You forgot that. So when I talked at U32, people had no idea. I said, we don't know whether we have that year's extension yet. Yes, we do. No, we don't, because only the House voted on it, and then the Senate, and then the
Well-
governor may or may not. I'm assuming he'll approve it, but
the
may not.
language that was in the version of H39 I read was was just almost
Awful. Yeah.
meaningless. I would just as soon
I
have.
just wanted to know how they made the decision of which towns get a year and which don't.
Well,
That was interesting.
I think there's two issues right now. One issue is a no-brainer, and that issue is, should there be a simple year's delay for the districts that are being forcibly merged?
Right.
And let me explain. You have a district like ours, where I live in Greensboro. We were told for 2 years we couldn't be forcibly merged. That's what Donna Russo Savage said in emails. I have copies of them. Okay,
Oh.
you can't be merged. Your structure forbids it. Okay, but 2 weeks before the final order is delivered,
Right.
we're told we're
Yes,
going to be merged.
Right.
And so here you are, you know, at the end of the road, being told you're going to be merged. And to say you're going to do it all by July 1st,
Right.
and we expect you all to love each other, kiss, and all work together, that's silly. So the 1 year delay is a no-brainer. The more difficult question really is, how do we merge? And what do we get to vote on, and what don't we get
Right,
to vote on?
right.
And those are difficult questions that I really think the legislature ought to spend some time looking at. And I think there are those that want to look at it. You know, we have the problems of enormously unbalanced indebtedness. You have a community like East Montpelier with $7 million worth of debt, being merged with Calais and Worcester.
Berlin.
Well, Berlin's got what, $5 million worth
Yeah,
of
that
debt?
was from a construction we did 2 years
Okay,
ago. Yeah.
but you've also got these communities like Calais and Worcester with no
Nothing.
debt.
Yeah, they
And-
have extra money. They have a set-aside fund.
That they've, right, and so
Silly
you have, it's like saying, you have a $300,000 mortgage on your house, and Ben has no mortgage at all, and we as the legislature have decided, you know, we really like you, and so we're going to give $150,000 of your mortgage, and we're just going to shift it.
Right.
On,
Thank you, Ben.
And Act 46 and Act 49 didn't say one word about transferring debt
Oh,
or
really?
property. There isn't a single word in either of those laws about the transfer of debt.
Where do they have the power? Oh,
You
silly
tell me.
I'm sorry. Excuse me. Lost my mind for a minute. I thought this
as
was
a
America.
lawyer, I'm troubled by that. We have an unelected executive board
Right.
that has issued default articles of agreement that say not only is your debt being shifted, but this article and these default articles can't be amended. So don't talk about it.
Right.
You're going to shift your debt, and he's going to pay it, and that's the way it is. Now, you got to vote on it. You got to think about it. You got to do a budget. You got to talk to your bankers
Right.
and figure out what the interest rate is going to be, and can we afford it? And this isn't just a 1-year loan. This is a 20-year loan.
Right.
Okay? But all of a sudden, a board comes along and says,
Nope, just
you
kidding.
know what? Whoop! We're giving it to
Well,
Ben.
this is what really upset me. We've talked about this, I don't know, 1,000 times here. Barrytown. They had a duly warned vote on whether they wanted to merge or not. Duly warned. They all went, checked the box, and everybody said no. 3 times they said no, and this group said, "Oh yes, you are. You're merging." If you're asked to do a duly elected, I don't know, it's America kind of thing, duly elected vote, and the voters vote no, and then you turn around and go, why bother having them vote?
I know. It was silly. If you vote yes, it's okay. If
Yeah,
you vote no, it doesn't matter.
Exactly. I said, do a non-binding resolution. Don't insult people.
I know. That was
3
silly.
times.
I know.
And then the last time they had it, they knew if they didn't vote yes, that they would lose the incentives. So everybody voted yes.
But you know what troubles
Rude.
me is the law itself said, if you want to retain your current governance structure, and you can come to us and show you're meeting the goals, you can retain your current governance structure. The board will evaluate your Section 9 proposals on the
Right,
merits.
right.
And what the law said, anybody can read it and understand that. And in the final analysis, saying all of these people who worked so hard, put in thousands of hours to develop these proposals, not only are we going to reject the proposals,
Right.
but you're getting punished.
Yeah, right.
We're
You
gonna
don't get
shift,
the incentive.
You don't get the incentives. We're going to shift debt onto your shoulders.
Yeah.
And oh, by the way, we are giving small schools grants forever to the districts that did what we wanted them to do. And even though you did what we said you could do, and you worked harder, and you said you were willing to walk away from these incentives in order to keep the school that you think is really best for your community, we're going to take your small schools grants away eventually. You know, it's like
This is very depressing.
They
They don't get it, do they?
Well,
they don't understand.
it-
The board, whoever.
I don't know.
It's just ridiculous.
You know what's more
very
scary
sad.
is the legislature doesn't understand either,
Yeah, well,
because all the people that wrote Act 46
Yeah.
are not there anymore.
Well,
Oh, that's true. They had a huge turnover. I
Most
didn't
of
think
them.
about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, let's talk about what this year we've in Berlin voted on our year's budget, just Berlin school. But at some point, whenever they get together and decide we should merge, we're all going to be called back to do a unified budget, and I think it's going to be a little more than what we just voted on. I think it might be with the 5 towns. And I think what you were saying is we have to share all the bonding indebtedness, and Calais loses its money because it gets put into the big pot.
Right.
So they were smart enough to save money. Their money goes in and gets divvied up among the other towns. I don't think that's right, David. So you put in a lawsuit. Could you talk about that lawsuit with 34?
there were 33 school
33
districts
school
that
districts.
that asked originally to be plaintiffs.
Yeah.
And we thought going forward, the best thing we could do would be to get a preliminary injunction so
Right.
that we could get a decision on the merits. The
Could you
judge,
explain what a preliminary injunction is to folks?
basically what a preliminary injunction says is we want to preserve the status quo. We don't know the outcome of this case, and the outcome is going to have an impact on communities going forward. And so without knowing what that impact is going to be, maybe we should keep things as they are and do the best we can to minimize harm.
Okay, but the lawsuit goes forward on all the
Yeah,
issues that
yeah,
you've
the
brought.
lawsuit would go forward.
Okay.
And eventually there would be a decision on the merits, and then if the appellants were to lose, then mergers would go forward. As it stands now, some of these mergers will go forward, but as the train gets farther and farther down the track, these communities' indebtedness, their capital funds,
Right.
their budgets, their staff, they become intermingled. And the more they become entangled, the more difficult it is to unwind them and bring the train back to the station.
So let me ask you something. Once we get merged, speaking of indebtedness, if Berlin had to completely put on a new roof, everybody has to weigh into that, right? Because they're going to be sharing in the cost.
Well, that's right. That's right.
And how willing would they be to?
Well, that's, I think, one of the interesting things that will unfold in our district. Let me use our district as an example. The towns that have been forcibly merged are Woodbury, Hardwick,
Right.
Stannard, and Greensboro. Hardwick has about 2,500 people. Woodbury, I would guess, has 300. Stannard might have 300. Greensboro might have 700. But Hardwick outvotes everybody. So, and you know, I think a Vermont tradition has always been working together, being good neighbors.
Right.
I think we built barns together. We've gone to town meetings together. We've really, I think, been good neighbors. But we're human beings, and self-interest is a powerful force.
Right.
And I think if you stop and ask yourself, which community's school is going to get a bond issue and which ones aren't, I'm afraid, even in Vermont,
Yep.
the answers are pretty obvious.
Right. This is very exciting this evening. I'm very
Exciting
depressed.
or disheartening?
Yeah, can we all go out and have a
exactly.
bourbon?
So exactly. There's a great beer place right across. We had a marvelous clip on YouTube, which is gone, as you and I talked about it. But it was about you presenting to the board, and I thought you came up with some amazing things that you were talking to the board about. And I thought I'd just throw them out, and you can respond why you said what you said, because you said that the Agency of Education and the board are not doing their jobs. I was very impressed with that statement.
I get carried away sometimes.
Well, I thought it was great.
I'm not sure I'm real popular in the.
Well, I don't know. I was like, go David. I thought it was great. And you also said, pretty much what we're saying, that they have not evaluated the town's alternatives on their merits, and they didn't. I mean.
No, they didn't
but
do that
are
at
they
all.
asking you to, I mean, those are just the way we think.
If you listen, in my opinion, and look, I want to be clear. I know there's good people on our State Board of Education. There's bright people. Oliver Olson's a bright guy.
Yes, Oliver.
I have enormous respect for John Carroll. I disagree with Bill Mathis countless times, but I in no way challenge his intelligence or his integrity. A decent man. And I'm sure these are people that really care about education. But when I listen to what happened, and when I juxtapose that with the language of the law, I can't make sense out of it.
Don't they have an attorney who should be guiding them?
This is one of the problems, I think. And again, I've got enormous respect for Donna Russo-Savage. I think she knows education laws.
She sure has
as
been
well
involved
as,
in it.
And but she was at Legislative Council and drafted the law,
Right.
then at the agency, advising the agency, and then very much through the process of consideration by the board, advising the board. And in my opinion, the board, at the very beginning of this process, should have had outside counsel with a second set of eyes. I think, I don't know, I believe it went off the tracks. I believe that Section 9 was plainly intended to embrace the idea of high-quality schools coming forward and presenting data that showed they were doing their job, and if they were, allowing them to keep their current governance structure, not putting them in a position where they could be compromised or even destroyed by a bigger community.
Yeah, and that's what happened to Stode, isn't it? They were working on this thing, and just like you said.
Well, I think that's a big, Stowe is in court
Yeah, right.
in a separate case,
Yeah.
along with, quite frankly, Stowe's in an enviable position because the communities that they are being forcibly merged with agree with them. Elmore and Morrisville
Oh, yeah, right.
agree with Stowe. Here you have the board saying we're going to merge you all together, and all three communities are saying, no, you're making a mistake.
Right,
For
right.
Pete's sake, stop.
And
think."
they worked hard on their alternative, and they were told it was good.
It was good.
And then they pulled the rug out.
It's a
from
great
under them.
school.
Yeah.
They do a great job. But, you know, I have to say, what I think is really sad is the people in Elmore. I spent quite a bit of time talking to families in Elmore. They had high school choice, and they really loved their little elementary school and having high school choice. It's why a good number of the families that lived there went there in the first place. And they voted against the merger to begin with. And then what happened was they had what I would call kind of a midnight vote, where it was re-voted at a time when it minimized turnout. And the people that voted to merge did so believing that their tax rates were going to go down. Unbeknownst to them, that if these forced mergers do go through, there's a couple of big bond issues waiting at their doorstep.
Right.
They're in for a big surprise.
Right.
And they have
Scary.
no voting
no
power.
recourse, right?
And
Well,
Elmore?
Yeah.
Elmore is like, you know,
So cute.
but it by virtue of its size, it's going to be crushed.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the voting power of Elmore versus the voting power of Morrisville.
Yeah,
and,
Morrisville, right?
They
Or Stowe for that
or
matter.
Stowe, yeah, they're
So-
just like a tiny fish in a very big
Yeah.
pond.
Very bad.
But you know, the line in the board's final order was something like, "We need a new definition of us."
Oh, interesting. Who are us? Who are us?
Who
Yeah,
knows?
good.
You talked also in your remarks about geographic isolation and some of those corresponding safety issues we talked earlier about transportation.
Yeah.
What are some of those challenges and even added costs with?
Well, one of the things that the original law said was that the board shouldn't be merging districts together where it isn't practicable. And one of the realities of this, the Act 46 also said it's not the intent of the legislature to close small schools, but the default articles of agreement that were put forth by the board in their final order essentially says after 2 years,
Right,
you can
you can
start
merge.
closing small schools if you
Right.
want. And so what I think is going to happen is you have in these small rural communities, especially in places like Montgomery, Berkshire, Sheldon, and then down south, Windham, some of the other small towns, you have these really difficult situations with mountain roads, dirt roads, heavy snowfall, and you close one school, or you close even a couple of grades in a school like that, and you start putting kids on these buses with these longer bus rides and less safe bus rides. I mean, to me, that's not practicable. And the law said if it's not practicable, you shouldn't do it. But the board didn't seem to be interested in those issues.
Yeah, who did we have on the show that talked about how difficult it's going to be to find a bus company large enough to deal with the supervisor? Who was that?
It was one of the school board members from up in Lowell, I think.
Oh, well, yeah, they said that with the merger, that there's not really a bus company big enough and cheap enough to handle the whole new district, and they may have to go back to the small, and that's more organization and more costs because you're dealing with so many different bus companies that the services aren't out there.
Well, fortunately, a lot of those schools in the North Country Supervisory Union were not forcibly merged.
Yeah, no, Lowell wasn't, right?
I think that's probably a good thing because in particular in that area where you have such high levels of poverty, it's especially important that the towns keep their school. And I think the board's reason, at least what they wrote, was because the population is so sparse, there isn't really a lot of efficiency to be achieved here. Whatever its reasoning was, it's something I'm very grateful for, that those small schools in our highest poverty communities are probably going to remain.
Right. Good.
Another one of those examples was South Hero,
Yeah.
because the closest district that operated the same grade levels as South Hero was 45 minutes away.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think they were in a similar position. That was, I think, one of the ones that was exempted from.
I don't remember. I don't remember what happened with South Hero.
Yeah, they just didn't have anyone that operated the same grade levels anywhere near them.
So and now, of course, everybody was waiting to see what the court would say. This is the Superior Court of Franklin County.
Yeah.
And they came down on the wrong side, this gang.
Well,
And
I'm a lawyer. I'm not going to criticize the court.
no, they did a wonderful job.
I'm an officer of the
But
court.
I found it interesting. Some of the things that they said was the reason that they voted against the request. Maybe you could talk
Well,
about.
and to clarify, this is just the request for preliminary injunction.
Yeah, for
that they
preliminary
rolled on.
injunction. And with what they were saying, it was a 25-page document, so there was a whole lot of stuff in there. Did you learn anything from what they said that could help you going forward about what they're looking for or how they're interpreting the laws? Because, 25 pages just to say no is a lot of pages.
Well, I think probably for the time being, while we're in front of that court, I probably
should not say
I'll
anything.
probably just
Then we'll just be quiet.
I'll probably skip that
Okay.
question.
That's fair.
We love the courts, yes we do. Well, then we can go back to my favorite thing, which is giving the land that we own to the supervisory union for $1. That is stuck in my craw since I heard it, and there are folks that are trying to figure out a way out of it. So in Berlin, we have the school and all the property around it, and apparently you just sell it all to the supervisory union for $1, right?
Yeah.
And you said that's not anywhere written?
No, there's nothing in Act 46 or Act 49 that specifically addresses issues regarding the conveyance of property or the transfer of
So
debt.
where is that agreed to or written?
Well, this becomes real complex, but in the Vermont statutes today, there is a process that is laid out for the voluntary creation of union school districts.
Right.
And that process requires a vote on the part of each community, and when they vote in favor of merger, debt and assets come with them.
Right.
They vote. They
Right.
say affirmatively, this is what we want to do. The agency and the board, despite the fact that there is no similar process laid out for involuntary mergers, have assumed and gone forward as if a forcibly merged district has the same consequences as a voluntarily merged district.
Oh,
That raises all kinds of
interesting.
issues. You know, we have a common benefits clause in Vermont. The common benefits clause says everybody needs to be treated equally. In this case, one community gets to vote on incurring a debt. Another community doesn't get to vote. One community gets to consider their budget. They get to talk about whether or not they can afford to
Right.
pay this money going forward for the next 20
Right.
years. Another community doesn't get to. So it raises a lot of questions. But more importantly, there's a question about whether or not the legislature had a duty to lay out a process and to put themselves on record of what they expected. Curiously, the chairs of both the House and Senate Education Committee, when they wrote Act 49, understood that maybe this was a problem, and they said to the School Boards Association, the Superintendents Association,
Right.
and the agency, if you think there are specific things we need to have voted on, come forward and tell us. And the School Boards Association wrote a letter on behalf of all three in March of, I think, 2018, last year, and said,
Oh.
no, we don't think there's anything you need to do. Just leave it the way it
Coincidence.
is. Now, I mean, I was like
Really?
dumbfounded. I mean, these are really, really big questions.
Yeah.
And if, in fact, the legislature intended forcibly merged communities to have the same consequences without votes, I think they should have said so. What they did say was the board should take into consideration greatly imbalanced indebtedness. The board didn't even do
Yeah,
that.
I don't understand that, why we should all absorb somebody else's debt and why they can't handle that separately and let Berlin pay for its debt. And,
Well, you just need to get a new definition of us.
well, there you go. That would be a great tagline, new definition of us.
So I've got a couple questions around where we're at in this evolving process, I guess, of Act 46. And we just had town meeting last week.
Right.
A lot of school districts that are involved in the lawsuit, had to decide how they were going to move forward on budgets and whether they were going to present an individual budget or a
Right.
new merged district budget, or if they were going to present the budget at all. And
Right.
Where did a lot of those districts land that you're
Because
talking
I
to?
found out that if they didn't, and David would know this better than me, if they didn't vote on the one-year budget, they could spend up to 85% of the prior year's.
That's if they don't
budget.
pass a budget before.
Yes, the one-year budget, or not
Well,
the combined budget, right?
these districts need to get budgets and they need to put them in place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they need to do everything they possibly can to ensure that they go forward smoothly without trauma. They have employees, they have students that they're responsible for. And what many districts have done was, at least in the districts that we've represented, is they've created individual budgets that can be seamlessly merged if need
Right.
be. And there's no reason why you shouldn't do that. I mean, I think that was wise.
Yeah, our budget is
Do-
the one that's going to be put into the bigger pot.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
I think I think that what was really called for in this situation was kind of a special level of leadership, especially from superintendents. There was, I think, a lot of pressure put on superintendents to move towards mergers as quickly as they could.
Right.
The agency licenses superintendents, and superintendents work for their boards. So I think some
just
superintendents
get her
were kind of
done.
caught between a rock and a hard place.
Right.
And I think that was difficult for superintendents. But with real cooperation and leadership, there's no reason why these districts can't have budgets that are put in place and that can be seamlessly merged.
I just think there are some problems, though, they may not be able to resolve from a budget. What did you vote on in Burlington?
Well, we didn't have any mergers in Burlington.
No, so you just had the budget, right?
Yeah, just the budget.
So there's nothing going to impact Burlington because it's so,
Almost no one in Chittenden County is impacted except
Right.
for Huntington.
Well,
Oh, really?
Huntington.
who has their own lawsuit.
Right.
Oh, Huntington put it, so there's 3 lawsuits?
Yeah,
Yes.
Huntington.
Interesting.
Huntington is.
So
gone to court.
what happens next for you that you're now gotten this?
Well, we'll have a hearing on the state's motion to dismiss. If that's granted, we'll go to the Supreme Court. If it's not granted, we'll have a hearing on the merits. And I would imagine, regardless of what happens with the hearing on the merits, we will, one way or the other, wind up in the Supreme Court that way.
Right.
So
Are
eventually,
there a
I
lot of
think,
constitutional issues in what you've presented?
I think there are.
Yeah,
Yes,
I think so,
I
too.
think there are quite a few constitutional
Yeah.
issues.
I
I
don't
think
know what they
there's
were
a
thinking.
there's a separation of powers issue. There's a common benefits issue.
Yeah.
On the U.S. Constitution, there's an equal protection issue. I think, quite frankly, I think there's an issue with what's called Section 68 of Chapter 2 of the Vermont Constitution, which says each town shall maintain a convenient number of school. I can't remember the exact language, but each town shall maintain. I think it says convenient number of schools for the education of their students,
Oh.
and the legislature may permit something different. I think that language says there's an obligation to have a school in each
right.
town. The legislature can permit something different, but it doesn't say the legislature can compel something different. And I think, quite frankly, this is just my opinion, and take it for what it's worth, with default articles of agreement that basically give the power of your bigger neighbor to close your school, that raises constitutional issues for me.
Right.
So, and the courts will rule on it. Interestingly, that was an issue that was raised by Brooke Page. He went to court.
He apparently did a really good job, didn't he? I mean,
Well,
they didn't
the
think
court-
he had an interest.
But what happened was, they
yeah.
dismissed his case
Yeah.
because they said he didn't have standing.
Standing. That's
But I do think the issue he raised is an important one.
Yeah.
And there's some language in Brigham to the contrary, but it's dicta. It's not binding language. And the Brigham case never really did an historical analysis of Section 68. The language about permitting something besides having a school in your town didn't get put into the Constitution until 1964, at a time when a few small towns wanted to tuition their students
Right.
and not operate an elementary school. And in order to allow them to do that, to break away from the obligation of at least having an elementary
school,
school, they said the legislature can permit something different. So it raises, in my mind, a really interesting question.
Right, because the original version of the Vermont Constitution basically said towns are responsible for providing education.
Well, they said each town was obligated to have adequate schools for the convenient education of their students.
Right.
And that's something I think that we can be proud of, that we've been committed to providing education since before we were a state,
Yeah.
when we were an independent republic.
And I think that is one of the things that was always going to be an issue with Act 46 from the beginning. If we ever got to the forced merger phase of Act 46, where towns voted against, being merged, and they were forced to merge anyway, we were always going to end up in an issue or in a conflict with that piece of the Constitution.
Yeah, and I don't think it's been adequately addressed by the courts. In fact, I don't think it's ever been presented fully. It's interesting because in the 1890s, we went through a process of consolidation. We had something over 1,000 school districts back in the 19th century, and the legislature decided then that it wanted to at least have each town
Right.
be a district. We had so many one-room schools, and it's funny when I was growing up, and God, maybe it makes me sound really old, but some of my friends in high school had gone to one-room schools, and they were just as well educated and just as smart as I was. So I sometimes wonder, how do we really develop the best schools?
Yeah.
It's a hard question. But there were, when I was at Otter Valley High School, I lived with a family in Sudbury, and their children had gone to a one-room schoolhouse, and they were really bright kids. They were on the debate team, and one of them went on to become a teacher, and married a school superintendent. And so
That's cool.
Well-
Maybe that's a good teacher-student relationship in,
Yeah.
in the schoolhouse.
you got to be careful of that.
I know.
But the important distinction between what happened in the 1890s and what's happening with Act 46 is that we were going from school districts based around an individual school to school districts based around a town, which is still
Right.
consistent with
But
the
the-
Constitution.
That's
that
right,
was in
and the
place at time.
Constitution itself, in every iteration, said each town shall maintain an adequate number of schools for the. It was focused on the town from the
Right.
beginning.
From the beginning.
And then in 1890, when we had, I guess it was called the Vicious Act.
Shows you how popular it
Yeah.
was.
Somebody's name. That's
Yeah,
what.
and so they still kept the focus on the town, but they made the budget a town budget,
Right.
And a school district was the town.
So we're sort of stuck with all of this unless you prevail in court. No pressure, David. Just, but if the lawsuits don't prevail, where does that leave us? Merging.
You know what? The sky won't fall.
Yeah.
The world will keep spinning.
But if we don't like
Vermont
some
will
of
be
it-
diminished, and you know what? Progress, I've decided, isn't linear. You go sideways, you go backwards, you go forwards, and you hope in your lifetime the net result is positive. But
You sure you're not running, David?
I'm absolutely
Good grief! I
positive.
got to write all this down.
But I think, especially small rural
That's
communities
right.
will be losers.
Yeah, because that's really the hub of our communities. I mean, it is even in Berlin. I don't have any kids,
And-
but the school's it.
And there's this, I think, growing schism between Chittenden County and the rest
I
of
agree with
Vermont.
you, right.
And Chittenden County exercises enormous influence over public policy and the future all of us
Right.
are going to have. And the voice for rural Vermont has been muted. I am, to a large extent, disappointed in some of our leadership. And I would have liked to see the folks, and these people are my friends, okay? But I would have liked to have seen the folks from the Northeast Kingdom a lot more vocal
Right.
and active.
Right, because this has been going on, as we just said, for 5 years, and all of
But
a sudden
we don't have-
people are waking up and going, what?
We don't have any representation on the ed committees.
Ah,
And the chair of both ed committees are from Chittenden County.
that's true. Wow. Well, we have run out of time. Thank you, David, very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well,
Good
thank
luck.
you.
Thank you, Ben.
See you, Ben.
Thank you
Yeah.
for tuning in. We'll see you next week, and in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.